The desert remembers everything. It remembers the footsteps of prophets, the march of conquerors, and the cries of empires turned to dust. But in the summer of 1967, the deserts of the Middle East would once again bear witness to history, this time written in fire, metal, and blood. This is the story of a war that lasted only 6 days, but changed the course of the next 6 decades. A war that redrew borders, transformed faith, and forever altered the balance of power in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. In just 6 days, the fate of the Middle East would be rewritten. Cities would fall, borders would disappear, and a new chapter of history would begin. This is the story of the 6-Day War, the war that changed everything. Before the sky burned, before the world saw lightning flash across the Middle Eastern skies, before fighter jets roared over deserts and cities, before maps were redrawn in 6 astonishing days, there was peace, a fragile, deceptive calm. In the heart of the Middle East, where borders are lines drawn in the dust and history seeps into every grain of sand, a new kind of battle was brewing. Not a clash of armies, at least not yet, but a fight over something older, more essential. It all began with water, a simple, vital element that flowed silently through the lands of the Middle East, and yet, in the mid-1960s, would become the spark that ignited one of the most dramatic wars of the 20th century. Israel, a young nation barely 2 decades old, faced an unrelenting challenge: survival in a land of scarcity. The Negev desert, which stretched across much of the southern half of the country, was arid and unforgiving. Every drop of water mattered. Every river, every stream, every drop of rain that reached the Sea of Galilee was incalculably valuable. In the mid-1960s, Israeli engineers achieved what many thought impossible. They began channeling the waters of the Sea of Galilee through an ambitious network of pipes and canals, sending life-saving water south into the arid lands of the Negev. It was a national victory, a symbol of ingenuity and hope, but across the border in Syria, this act was perceived very differently. The Golan Heights, a towering plateau that looms over northern Israel, was then under Syrian control. Most of the rivers and streams that fed the Sea of Galilee originated in those highlands, winding through Syrian soil before emptying into Israel's lifeline. For Syrians, Israel's use of those waters was more than just a technical feat. It was a provocation, the exploitation of a shared resource. So in 1964, Syria acted. Under a scorching sun, Syrian bulldozers began excavating a new canal through the rocky terrain of the Golan Heights. The plan was bold and direct: to divert the headwaters of the Jordan River, thus cutting off Israel's access to the streams that fed the Sea of Galilee. For Israel, it was an existential threat. Without water, the Negev would wither. Crops would die, settlements would fail, and the dream of a prosperous desert homeland would begin to fade. As soon as the first shovels sank into Syrian soil, the countdown to war began. For nearly 20 years, Israel lived under the shadow of conflict. Since its birth in 1948, it had never known full peace. The roots went back even further to 1947, when the United Nations proposed dividing the British-controlled Palestinian territory into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab. For the Jewish community, scarred by the horrors of the Holocaust, this resolution represented a rebirth. But for Palestinian Arabs and most of the Arab world, it was an outrage, a division of their territory sanctioned by foreign powers. When the British withdrew in 1948, chaos ensued. 7 Arab armies stormed into the new state of Israel, vowing to crush it before it could even breathe. What followed was the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, known in Israel as the War of Independence. Against all odds, Israel survived. Not only did it endure, but it also expanded beyond the borders proposed by the UN. However, victory came at a price. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians became refugees, and the seeds of bitterness were sown deep in the Middle Eastern soil. By 1949, the guns had ceased, but peace was nowhere to be found. What emerged instead was a fragile and uneasy truce, a tense pause between battles rather than an end to them. Armistice lines were drawn but not accepted as borders. Along all borders, including Lebanon to the north, Syria to the northeast, Jordan to the east, and Egypt to the southwest, mistrust, fear, and hatred reigned. For the next 2 decades, Israel lived like a besieged fortress. Between 1948 and 1967, Israel's greatest enemy was geography itself. The country was tiny, with a strip of land no larger than the US state of New Jersey. Its shape resembled an hourglass, with its narrowest point separating the Mediterranean coast from the Jordanian hills. To the north, the rugged Golan Heights rose above the fertile Galilee region. Syrian gunners posted on those heights could, and often did, fire on Israeli villages and fields with terrifying accuracy. To the east, Jordanian artillery in the Judean hills could bombard Tel Aviv or the narrow coastal plain almost at will. Israel had no room to retreat, no natural barriers to defend, and no depth to absorb an attack. A single enemy advance could cut the country in two. Therefore, Israel's defense strategy had to be based on speed, precision, and prevention. The Israel Defense Forces could not afford protracted wars of attrition like those fought in Europe during World War I. Its economy was small, its population limited, and its resources scarce. Every soldier, every bullet, every plane mattered. If war were to break out, Israel would have to strike first. It would have to take the fight to the enemy before the enemy could strike at its heartland. As Syrian engineers continued the canal project in 1964, Israeli planes circled low over the Golan Heights. The excavations became miniature battlefields, with raids, aerial skirmishes, and artillery exchanges illuminating the border. Every clash escalated the tension, every exchange a test of mettle. The Middle East, already a hotbed of old grudges and new ambitions, was beginning to boil over. It was becoming a struggle for existence, pride, and dominance in a region where every border was fragile and every belief deeply held. And as the rains of 1966 gave way to the dry heat of 1967, few realized that the world was just weeks away from witnessing one of the most astonishing military campaigns in modern history, a war that would last a mere 6 days, but transform the Middle East forever. From Suez to a shouting match at sea. The stage had been set years before 1967 with a series of decisions that tightened like a noose. In 1956, during the explosive Suez Crisis, Britain and France leaned on a reticent Israel and convinced its leaders to attack Egypt. For a brief, thunderous interval, Israeli columns crossed the Sinai in waves, reaching the very fringes of the peninsula. The operation was bold, surgical, and humiliating for Gamal Abdel Nasser's regime, and it provoked an unexpected international response. What triggered that confrontation was politics. The first United Nations emergency force was deployed in the Sinai. Where guns once rang out, peacekeepers now patrolled. Where tanks once rolled, international observers watched. For a time, the region was on the verge of exploding. But an explosion is tension feigning calm. By the 1960s, that fragile calm had begun to crack. Border clashes between Syria and Israel erupted repeatedly around the Golan Heights, a rocky amphitheater from which Syrian artillery could level Israeli farms and villages. Each crack widened the chasm of mistrust. And in Cairo, President Nasser saw his authority weaken under pressure. His voice had become the rallying cry of pan-Arab nationalism. However, by the mid-1960s, rivals and critics were beginning to whisper that his star was fading. Nasser would not tolerate appearing weak. If Syria became the main obstacle to confronting Israel, his leadership would be hollowed out. He needed to act, and the scenario presented itself. On May 16, 1967, in a single decisive order, Nasser directed the United Nations to withdraw its peacekeeping force from the Sinai. What he had hoped for was a calculated diplomatic effort, a dispute that would leave some UN presence in place, but that did not happen. To Nasser's surprise, and perhaps to his horror, the UN complied almost immediately. The peacekeepers packed up and left the Sinai as if the clock had struck. The barrier that had held back an all-out confrontation vanished within a week. Suddenly, Egypt found itself unprotected on Israel's southwestern flank. Nasser, who had been spouting fiery rhetoric about Israel's destiny, found himself directly facing the embattled young nation with nothing between them except the desert and destiny. There was another, far more immediate pressure point, the Straits of Tiran. These narrow waterways at the mouth of the Gulf of Aqaba constituted Israel's vital sea route to the southeast. Thus, with naval guns and troops deployed on the Sinai coast, Egypt could effectively blockade the Israeli port of Eilat. International law considered the strait an international waterway despite its proximity to the Egyptian shores. Closing it to Israeli shipping would, in effect, be an act of war. Then the escalation became impossible to ignore. The Egyptian ranks swelled. On May 20th, Cairo called up reserves and put the economy on a war footing. Factories slowed their activity, trains emptied, and men in civilian clothes reported to the barracks. Under intense pressure, King Hussein of Jordan was persuaded and intimidated by Nasser to join forces with Egypt and Syria. The Syrians continued their canal project across the Golan Heights. Egyptian armored columns advanced toward the Sinai. Each move further tightened the noose around Israel. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, international problems began to worsen. The US Sixth Fleet was deployed on heightened alert in the eastern shipping lanes as a signal. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet also moved, shifting ships through strategic straits as Cold War titans shadowed each other on the region's tides. Diplomatic voices rose and fell, but the most dangerous conversations took place with troops on the ground and cannons pointed skyward. By May 28th, Nasser's tone left no room for complication. He publicly declared that Egypt intended to wage all-out war with the destruction of Israel as its stated objective. When a leader openly promises annihilation, political factions within the targeted state rarely remain divided for long. Both Israeli pacifists and hawks found a rare unity. Such threats brook no nuance or delay. Back in Jerusalem, the urgency had become a drumbeat. On June 4th, after 7 hours of military briefings that revealed maps, satellite reports, and intelligence estimates, a national unity cabinet convened. Men and women whose disagreements had defined Israeli policy for years fell grimly silent and made the most terrible decision. They authorized the Prime Minister to go to war if the military council so dictated. Within hours, the order leaked. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, mindful of the weight of history and survival, instructed his defense minister Moshe Dayan to prepare for hostilities. The military moved with the same clinical efficiency that had defined Israel's covert successes in previous decades. The Israeli Air Force had perfected a ritual, a return procedure in which a plane could land, refuel, rearm, inspect, and take off again in as little as 8 minutes. In practice, this meant a plane could complete 8 cycles in one long day. In theory, if the entire Air Force flew at that pace, the cumulative damage would be enormous. The planners crunched the numbers. If the Air Force attacked with concentration over a single long morning, they could attempt not only to contest the skies, but also to destroy the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. Egyptian air bases were close together and their runways lightly patrolled, making the mission seem achievable, not just a dream. A decisive blow in a few relentless hours could tip the balance on 3 fronts. At dawn on June 5, 1967, the planes were ready. The pilots fastened their seatbelts, the ground crew checked the last few bolts, and the air smelled of jet fuel and anticipation. At 7:45 a.m. Israel time, the silence was absolute. The world didn't know it yet, but the quiet hum of Israeli airfields that morning was the sound that preceded the storm. Thunder at dawn. The morning of June 5, 1967 dawned like any other, but with a different charge, the faint electric calm that spreads over battlefields just before a lightning strike. In Cairo, Egyptian dawn patrols ascended the sky in orderly succession, following long-established routines to protect airfields, cities, and command centers. The patrols were supposed to overlap, leaving no gaps, but the reality of aerial routine is fragile. Planes land, crews refuel, bombs are replenished, and in those fragile minutes the sky can become empty. History often repeats its mistakes. A generation earlier, on December 8, 1941, American planes in the Philippines were refueling on the apron when the enemy attacked. That painful precedent hung in the air like a ghost. On that June morning, the same vulnerability would be exploited, with consequences rippling from Cairo to the world's capitals. At 8:45 Cairo time, radar operators looked up and saw nothing. The Egyptian dawn patrol was gone. In an instant, the sky changed color. From the window of his command plane, Egyptian War Minister Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amer stood with his chief of staff and a Soviet advisor. Together, they watched a dark plume of smoke rise from the West Cairo airfield. What he saw was not a single hit, but the collapse of a shield. Israeli planes attacked with scalpel-like precision. Pairs of fighters roared in low, deadly arcs. One passed to drop bombs, a second to sweep the airfield with cannon and rocket fire. They spent no more than 7 minutes over each target. Then they would disperse on the 20-minute flight back to their bases for the 8-minute turnaround that had become a hallmark of Israeli planning, wave after wave. As one formation completed its run, another was already airborne, heading for the Egyptian runways. Barely minutes passed between attacks. Egyptian airfields became incandescent targets, detonated fuel depots, burning hangars, taxiways turned into broken glass. Some of the first Israeli sorties were sent to confront the greatest threat, Soviet-made Egyptian bombers hidden near Cairo. Others fanned out into the far reaches of the desert, bombing fighter bases in the Sinai. The Israeli attack was not a scattered raid. It was an orchestrated and prioritized destruction of air power aimed at blinding the enemy skies before the advancing ground forces. Farther afield, the airfields serving Egyptian operations in Yemen were anything but safe. From the Red Sea, Israeli bombers attacked Ras Banas and Luxor, proving that geography could no longer protect an airbase once the skies belonged to the Israelis. It was only a matter of time before resistance arrived. In the morning, MiG-21s and MiG-19 took off from Hugari in the Sinai, diving into the smoke and flames. The encounter was brutal and brief. In some skirmishes, Egyptian aircraft were beaten out of the air. In others, desperate pilots tried to return to already cratered and smoking runways only to find their airstrips ripped into lethal reefs of asphalt and concrete. Surviving pilots had to bail out or watch their planes flip over in the desert. The scene at noon was devastating. Hundreds of Egyptian aircraft wrecked on the runway or burned beyond repair. By midday, Israeli reports tallied the destruction. Some 250 Egyptian aircraft destroyed, a figure that would resonate as an expression of the shock that had befallen Cairo's air force. Egyptian losses on the first day included many of its experienced pilots killed or wounded. Israeli losses, by contrast, were comparatively small. The scale of the destruction was psychological. An annihilated air force leaves a nation exposed in ways that maps and fortifications cannot repair. It wasn't just the Egyptian air force that was attacked. The Syrian air force, tricked by Cairo's rhetoric into attacking Haifa's oil refineries, was annihilated in detail. The Royal Jordanian Air Force attempted to support troops around Jerusalem, but suffered the same fate. Even Iraqi elements that had moved forward in support were neutralized. By noon on that first day, Israel had absolute air superiority in the skies over Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, a dominance that redefined the balance of power on every battlefield. Air superiority was more than an advantage. It was a force multiplier. It gave Israel reach and the ability to strike deeply and quickly with relatively few resources. It provided operational flexibility. Aircraft could move between fronts, respond to developing crises, and deny enemy reinforcements or withdrawal. It turned airspace into a superhighway for logistics and airborne troops, and a curtain through which Israeli ground forces could maneuver with far greater safety. What had made Egypt dangerous in theory was now exposed in practice. The Egyptian General Staff had devised a plan to defend the Sinai in depth, something that looked like a methodical system for absorbing an attacker and then destroying it as it advanced. But politics came between the plan and the practice. President Nasser, influenced by rhetoric and the need to appear offensive rather than defensive, ordered his forces forward. The army, trained and prepared to maintain layered defenses, redeployed, marching into unfamiliar territory to prepare for invasion, rather than patiently defending Cairo and the major supply lines that lay behind it. This redeployment had more profound consequences than the maps show. Soldiers ordered to abandon prepared positions and re-entrench in new terrain lose more than time. They lose cohesion, morale, and the quiet confidence of an army that knows its terrain. Troops weary of movement, ill-supplied and poorly led, do not suddenly become fighting machines when the shells start falling. Egyptian infantry, moved from their defensive belts into exposed forward positions, found themselves vulnerable to the scouting and rapidly evolving tactics the Israelis had perfected. Israel's operational concept on the ground was direct and ruthless: break through the fragile barrier of Egyptian forward units and then explode westward along the three main east-west routes in the Sinai to reach and destroy Egyptian reserves before they could regroup. The heaviest and bloodiest fighting would occur during that initial breakthrough. Once the cracks appeared, Israeli armor and infantry would advance and turn a tactical victory into operational momentum. And so, while smoke still rose over the cratered runways and the first survivors of the air battles were plucked from the wreckage, both sides prepared for the next act, ground forces poised, artillery at the ready, and commanders already calculating the cost of each hour. Even as the air war was about to end, the ground war was beginning. Fire in the desert. The desert does not forgive mistakes. It exposes all the weaknesses of men, machines, and plans made too far from the front. On June 5, 1967, the first day of the Six-Day War, that lesson would come crashing down on the Egyptian army. As dawn broke over the vast, gleaming desolation of the Sinai Peninsula, the Egyptian army was already on edge. They had received orders to advance and had massed along the border with Israel in an offensive posture. Their mission, according to President Nasser's forceful rhetoric, had been to invade Israel, push through the Negev, and link up with the Jordanian forces advancing from the east. But now the plan had backfired. By massing so close to the border, the Egyptians had left themselves little room for maneuver and no depth to absorb an Israeli counterattack. They had positioned their divisions where they could be seen, where they could be engaged, and where withdrawal would mean annihilation. At Abu Agela, a place soon to become famous in military history, the Egyptians built what they believed to be an impregnable fortress. Following Soviet doctrine, the Egyptians had dug belts of trenches in the desert, ringed with mines and covered by machine gun nests. Their right flank was secured by ridges of jagged rock and dry wadis, their left by shifting dunes. Artillery was positioned in the rear to rain down fire on any attacker. Behind, hidden from view, an armored reserve waited to strike. To anyone looking at the map, Abu Agela was a fortress of steel and sand. To the Israelis, it was a challenge demanding perfection. Brigadier General Ariel Sharon, already known among his men for his audacity, bordering on foolhardiness, commanded the Israeli division facing Abu Agela. He knew that breaking through there meant breaking the heart of the Egyptian line. Failure meant losing the war before it had even begun. So Sharon devised a plan that defied expectations. Instead of attacking Egypt's defenses head-on, he divided his forces into 3 coordinated arms: a tank force, a paratroop assault, and a mobile infantry spearhead. His tanks would circle wide, taking an uncharted route across the desert to prevent the Egyptian armored reserve from joining the fight. His paratroopers, helicoptered in under cover of darkness, would descend directly behind the Egyptian artillery lines, silencing their guns even before the main attack began. It was a long shot that required absolute trust in every man. As night deepened, Israeli helicopters circled low over the dunes, their blades gently beating in the warm desert air. Below, Egyptian gunners remained in their trenches, unaware of the shadows descending from the sky. Within minutes, Israeli paratroopers landed and opened fire, annihilating the Egyptian artillery crews. The silence that followed was eerie, with a stillness born of disbelief. At dawn, Israeli tanks and self-propelled guns began bombarding the left flank of the Egyptian trenches. The roar of artillery merged with the roar of rockets as clouds of sand billowed into the sky. As the barrage shifted, Israeli infantry sped through the dunes, their faces wrapped in scarves, weapons at the ready. Colored flares arced upward to mark their advance, red for here, green for advance, white for enemy neutralized. Behind them, tank gunners adjusted their aim with these flashes of light, firing in close coordination to keep the Egyptian defenders cornered. Israeli engineers advanced slowly, clearing minefields under enemy fire, marking safe routes for armored vehicles to pass. It was a brutal and chaotic dance of fire and dust, and it worked. By mid-morning, Sharon's men had breached the first line of trenches. Within hours, the second belt fell. The Egyptian defenders fought hard in the pockets, but command and communication were breaking down. Sharon's flanking armor began cutting off withdrawal routes. Then came the call Sharon had been waiting for. Brigadier Avraham Yoffe, posted nearby, radioed that he was ready to advance into the Sinai once the road was clear. Sharon gave the order to move friendly forces across an active battlefront. Even as the last Egyptian trenches were being cleared, Yoffe's forward units pressed forward, engines roaring as they surged westward into the open desert. The Israeli momentum was now unstoppable. Once the line at Abu Agela was broken, the war in the Sinai turned from a battle into a pursuit. The Egyptians, still braced for an offensive that would never come, suddenly found themselves in hot pursuit. Information gleaned from captured documents, intercepted signals, and reconnaissance patrols gave the Israelis a clear view of the Egyptian positions. They discovered a dangerous gap between the Palestinian 20th Division near Gaza and the Egyptian 7th Division to the west. At the Rafah crossing, the gap between them yawned like a wound. Meanwhile, the Israeli commanders knew exactly what to do. If they managed to advance north toward Rafah, they would not only disrupt Egypt's coordination with the Palestinian forces, but also attack the Egyptian army itself from the rear. The plan called for speed and aggression, both qualities the IDF possessed in abundance. Within hours, Israeli armored vehicles blasted through, raising supply convoys, severing telephone lines, and blocking roads. Egyptian command structures were thrown into confusion. Reports of Israeli advances came in faster than orders. What had begun as a frontline defense turned into a disorganized retreat across the scorching desert. By the end of the fourth day, 15,000 Egyptians had been killed or wounded, 5,000 captured, including 500 officers, and 80% of Egyptian heavy equipment had been destroyed or confiscated. Meanwhile, Israel had lost around 300 soldiers and suffered just over 1,000 wounded. 4 days after the first shot was fired, the entire Egyptian army in Sinai had been crushed. On June 8th, Egypt agreed to a ceasefire. The special forces that Israel had prepared to seize southern Sinai and Sharm el-Sheikh were barely needed. Egyptian resistance had already evaporated. Israeli sailors landed in Sharm el-Sheikh, raised their flag over the Straits of Tiran, and reopened the sea route that had started the conflict just weeks earlier. But Israeli leaders knew the war was far from over. The Israeli High Command faced an arithmetic nightmare. They had conquered the skies and destroyed the Egyptian army, but they were surrounded by Jordan to the east, Syria to the north, and the remnants of Egyptian influence to the south. They couldn't fight them all at once. So they resorted to the same principle Napoleon Bonaparte had employed a century and a half earlier, the strategy of the central position. The idea was simple but bold. Place the army between multiple enemies and attack them one by one before they could unite. As Israeli artillery advanced westward through the Sinai, other fronts intensified. In the east, King Hussein of Jordan had been drawn into the conflict, pressured by Nasser's bravado and his own alliances. Jordanian artillery had already opened fire along the border, shelling Israeli positions near Jerusalem. Egyptian advisors promised victory. What they offered was diversion. Late on June 5th, faced with the avalanche of news of an Israeli triumph in the Sinai, the Tel Aviv General Staff launched its operations. They redirected their reserves with reinforcing armored brigades, paratroopers, and infantry to the central front. The time had come to confront Jordan. The well-trained and proud Royal Jordanian Army maintained 6 infantry brigades in the West Bank, 3 in the northern hills of Samaria, 2 guarding Jerusalem itself, and 1 in the Judean highlands south of Bethlehem. 2 armored brigades stood ready to attack as the punching fist of Hussein's army. The Israelis met them with a hastily assembled combination of formations. The Jerusalem Brigade, 2 reserve infantry brigades guarding the narrow Israeli coastal corridor, and a division borrowed from the northern front. Enough to hold, but not to attack, until now. With Egypt's collapse, Israel could finally concentrate all its forces on Jerusalem. The spearhead would be Colonel Uri Ben-Ari, a German-born armored corps commander, his cigar clenched between his teeth as he led the 10th Mechanized Brigade. Alongside him, the battle-hardened paratroopers of the 55th Brigade, once prepped for airdrops into Egypt, were reassigned to the Judean hills. As Ben-Ari's armored columns blasted through the rocky terrain north of Jerusalem, they cut the West Bank in 2, cutting Jordanian supply lines before the defenders could regroup. Simultaneously, Israeli infantry, advancing from Lod Airport, took the old British fortress of Latrun, clearing access to the Holy City. In Amman, King Hussein faced the most agonizing decision of his life: retreat and risk humiliation, or fight on and risk destruction. Encouraged by his allies and driven by pride, he chose to attack. And as the sun rose over the ancient stones of Jerusalem, Jordanian aircraft streaked across the skies. The battle for the Holy City was about to begin. The battle for Jerusalem. The story of Jordan's King Hussein in the Six-Day War is one of tragic miscalculation, a man caught between loyalty, pride, and delusion. To understand his decisions, we must step back and look at his kingdom's perilous situation in 1967. Jordan was a small nation surrounded by giants, Egypt to the southwest, Syria to the north, and Israel to the west. Its survival depended on the shifting sands of Arab alliances and the cautious maneuvering of its young monarch, King Hussein. He ruled a country on the brink of history, a land that encompassed the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, one of the holiest territories on the planet. But Jordan's position was never secure. Both Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Syrian Ba'athist regime distrusted Hussein, considering him too moderate, too Western, too cautious in the face of Israel, and Hussein, in turn, distrusted them. He saw clearly that both Cairo and Damascus were driven as much by ambition as by Arab unity. They talked of liberation, but what they really sought was dominance over Israel, the Arab world, and perhaps one day Jordan itself. So, when Nasser and Syria began their fiery rhetoric against Israel in May 1967, King Hussein hesitated. He wanted no part in a war that might consume his tiny kingdom. But in the fever of Arab nationalism, hesitation seemed like betrayal. Standing aside would mean isolation. Fighting would mean destruction. And that was when Nasser played his most dangerous card, a lie so audacious it changed the course of the war. In the early hours of June 5, 1967, the Israeli Air Force attacked with devastating precision. In less than 3 hours, nearly the entire Egyptian Air Force was reduced to burning rubble in the desert. Runways burned. Pilots lay dead beside their wrecked planes. The Egyptian air defense network was gone, but in Cairo the truth was a luxury Nasser couldn't afford. He called King Hussein with false confidence and told him that 70% of the Israeli Air Force had been destroyed in heroic Egyptian counterattacks. It was a lie, a calculated and ruthless lie. But to Hussein, desperate to believe that Egypt still held strong, it rang with hope. If Israel had lost its air power, perhaps Jordan, together with Syria and Egypt, could deal the fatal blow to the Zionist state. Pressure from the Arab world increased. If Hussein refused to fight, he would be forever branded a coward and a traitor to the Arab cause. So, reluctantly and tragically, he decided to enter the war. Within hours, Jordanian airfields were attacked. Israeli planes, after completing their missions over Egypt and Syria, turned their attention eastward. They flew low over Amman and Mafraq, bombing precision airstrips, hangars, and radar stations. The small but well-trained Royal Jordanian Air Force never stood a chance. Within minutes, its entire fleet, including Hawker Hunters and Vampire jets, was ablaze. The skies over Jordan fell silent. King Hussein's army, brave but blind, would have to fight without air cover. Having lost the air war, Hussein turned to his ground forces. He ordered the 60th Armored Brigade, his most powerful formation, to advance from the Judean hills to block the Israeli advance. But the Israeli Air Force, now unopposed in the air, intercepted them. Wave after wave of Mirage fighters and missed-air aircraft pounded the columns, smashing them with rockets and cannon fire. The desert highway became a graveyard of tanks and trucks. At the same time, the Israeli paratroopers abandoned their plans for Egypt. They packed up their gear, left their desert maps behind, and fanned out toward Jerusalem. The city, divided since 1948, was now the next battlefield. For nearly 2 decades, the Jordanians had fortified East Jerusalem. They had built defenses as if anticipating a siege with a network of trenches, barbed wire, machine gun nests, and minefields. The buildings along the line between Ramat Rachel, Mount Scopus, and the Old City had been turned into fortresses, their basements connected by tunnels. It looked less like a city and more like a World War I fortress, a place where every corner could become a battlefield. And at the center of it all rose Ammunition Hill, a fortified mound just northeast of the Old City. It was the key to Jerusalem's northern defenses. Whoever controlled it could dominate the entire approach. Taking it would be hell, but the Israelis had no choice. At 2 a.m. on June 6th, under a silent black sky, the Israeli 55th Paratroopers Brigade began their assault on Ammunition Hill. They advanced on foot, fighting their way through barbed wire and trenches, exchanging fire with the Jordanian defenders who refused to budge an inch. Grenades exploded in the narrow passages. Machine gun fire rattled from every window and door. The battle devolved into a series of brutal hand-to-hand combats, with soldiers hurtling from trench to trench, fighting with rifles, bayonets, and sometimes their bare hands. The fighting raged for 4 relentless hours. By dawn, the air was thick with smoke and dust. The screams of the wounded echoed between the walls. When the sun finally rose over Jerusalem, Ammunition Hill fell silent. The Israeli flag flew where the Jordanian standard had once stood. The price was immense. Both sides fought bravely, and both bled profusely. To this day, Israeli soldiers remember it as one of the fiercest urban battles in their history, and for Jordanians it remains a symbol of courage in the face of unimaginable odds. While Jerusalem burned, another battle raged further north. Israeli divisions under Major General Elad Peled advanced into the Sumerian hills. The brigades advanced through Jenin, engaging entrenched Jordanian troops in brutal house-to-house combat. The Israelis encountered stiff resistance at Kabatia and fought throughout the night toward Nablus, the ancient city nestled in the mountain valleys. An Israeli column broke through to approach from the east. The inhabitants of Nablus, seeing the dust clouds of tanks on the horizon, mistook them for Jordanian reinforcements. They cheered until they saw the blue and white flag on the turrets. By then, the Jordanian command structure was crumbling. Reinforcements sent from the east were annihilated by Israeli air interdiction, and their convoys were smashed by rocket fire before they could reach the front lines. By the evening of June 6th, it was clear, Jordan could not hold Jerusalem. The Jordanian governor of the city, seeing no possibility of reinforcements and fearing an encirclement, ordered a withdrawal. At 8:30 a.m. on June 7th, the Israeli 55th Paratroopers Brigade launched its final assault. 2 battalions ascended the Mount of Olives, advancing past Augusta Victoria Hospital, and then descended the ridge into the Kidron Valley. A 3rd battalion, under Colonel Motta Gur, advanced directly toward the ancient walls of the old city. At St. Stephen's Gate, now known as Lion's Gate, Gur's men breached the walls. They advanced through the narrow, winding streets, clearing the houses one by one as the sound of gunfire echoed among the stones that had witnessed centuries of conquest and prayer. By 10 a.m., the old city of Jerusalem was safe. Israeli soldiers, dusty and bloodied, gathered near the western wall, touching its stones with trembling hands. For the first time in 1,900 years, the Jewish people stood sovereign in their ancient capital. South of Jerusalem, Israeli troops from the Jerusalem Brigade advanced through Bethlehem and Hebron, taking the Judean hills. North of the city, Ben Ari's 10th Brigade advanced through the Jordan Valley, cutting off the last Jordanian escape routes. But victory came at a price. Israel had lost 550 soldiers and 2,500 wounded. For Jordan, the loss was catastrophic. 6,000 men dead or missing, half the kingdom's population under occupation, and the heart of the Hashemite dream lost in a matter of days. King Hussein, betrayed by Nasser's false promises and abandoned by Syria's empty rhetoric, had no choice. On June 7th, he agreed to a ceasefire. He had fought valiantly, but he had been combating phantoms conjured by lies, illusions, and a dream of Arab unity that had died in the desert long before the first shot was fired. The battle for the heights. As night fell on the 3rd day of the 6-day war, the Middle East burned under the weight of decisions that had redefined its destiny forever. Egypt had started this war because it could not afford to appear weak in the face of its fierce northern neighbor, Syria. The Syrians, longtime antagonists of Israel, had fanned the flames of confrontation with reckless confidence, and soon Egypt followed suit, desperate to prove itself the true guardian of Arab pride. But Egypt's miscalculations were devastating. Within 4 days, its mighty army was destroyed in the Sinai Desert. Columns of Egyptian tanks, abandoned and burning, smoldered in the relentless sun. The soldiers fled west toward the Suez Canal in a chaotic retreat. Jordan had also joined the fight. King Hussein of Jordan did not want war. She had seen too many ghosts rise from the ashes of 1948. But surrounded by Arab pressure and fueled by President Nasser's lies that Israeli air power had been destroyed, she made a fatal decision. And because of that decision, the Royal Jordanian Army suffered its own collapse in just 3 days. While Egypt and Jordan faltered, Syria no longer hesitated. For years, the farmers of northern Israel lived in the shadow of the Golan Heights, a towering plateau that rises more than 600 meters above the fertile Sea of Galilee. From these heights, Syrian artillery could observe deep into Israeli territory, bombarding the peaceful kibbutzim and farms with shells. Living in northern Israel was living under constant threat. Children learned to run for shelters at the first whistle of enemy fire. Farmers ploughed their fields under the gaze of Syrian gunners who, from their concrete bunkers, observed their every move. The Golan Heights were a fortress in the sky. Whoever held them had power over the north, and now, with the fall of Egypt and Jordan, Syria stood alone, defiant, exposed, and furious. On June 8th, the fourth day of the war, Egypt finally agreed to a ceasefire. Cairo's silence left Damascus isolated, yet as Israeli leaders weighed their next move, Syrian guns thundered across the border again, artillery bombarded the Galilee, shells slammed into Israeli villages. 2 civilians were killed and 16 wounded in a final gesture of defiance from on high. It was enough. Israel's defense minister, Moshe Dayan, made his decision. The Golan Heights would no longer remain in enemy hands. The order at that moment was to take them. However, the task ahead was very difficult. The Golan was a natural fortress with a vast plateau of volcanic rock and deep ravines, almost impossible to assault frontally. The slopes leading to it were steep and treacherous, riddled with minefields and Syrian bunkers. Reaching the summit was like stepping into a lion's den. The Syrian army's defensive lines were organized in layers of steel and concrete, following Soviet doctrine. In the southern Golan, the 35th Brigade Group dug in deep in canyon country, with narrow, steep valleys where tanks could barely maneuver. In the north, the 12th Brigade Group held dominant positions, reinforced by infantry and armored reserves. 5 carefully selected and fiercely loyal Syrian Republican Guard battalions held fortified bastions in bunkers reinforced with steel and stone. Behind them waited the 42nd Brigade Group, Syria's mechanized strike force. With tanks, mechanized infantry, and reserves, they stood ready along the Damascus-Quneitra highway, ready to counterattack any Israeli breach. For Syria, the Golan Heights were the last shield before the heart of Damascus. Losing them would be unthinkable. On the Israeli side, 2 divisional task forces assembled for one of the most daring operations in modern military history. From the north, Reserve Brigadier Dan Lehner would lead his troops, including an armored brigade and the elite Golani Infantry Brigade, up the treacherous slopes near Tel Fahar and Tel Azaziat. From the south, another task force would deploy north to attack the southern face of the Golan. For 2 days prior to the assault, the Israeli Air Force unleashed a relentless bombardment. Wave after wave of aircraft circled over the plateau, raining bombs and rockets down on Syrian positions. The ground shook, and the once proud bunkers on the Syrian border shuddered under plumes of smoke. But when the airstrike ended, the Syrians were still there, waiting. On the morning of June 9th, Brigadier Lehner gave the signal. Israeli tanks, under the command of Colonel Albert Mandler, began their ascent under intense Syrian artillery fire. Shells whistled overhead and exploded on the slopes, covering the armored columns with molten shrapnel. Beside them, soldiers of the Golani Brigade advanced on foot. Their objective, Tel Fahar, one of the most heavily fortified positions on the entire front. However, the approach was a nightmare as the terrain was mined and barbed wired. Every step forward drew machine gun fire from bunkers hidden in the rocks. The first Israeli assault reached the fortifications with only 3 men left, and still, they did not stop. A second assault formed, with men crawling through the smoke and dust, throwing themselves over the wire obstacles so their comrades could cross them like living bridges. Hand grenades rattled in the trenches. Soldiers fought room by room, bunker by bunker, in ferocious hand-to-hand combat. By 6 p.m., Tel Fahar had fallen. The Israeli flag flew over the battered hilltop, its fabric torn by shrapnel, but flapping defiantly against the evening wind. As night fell on June 9th, the northern edge of the Golan Heights was finally in Israeli hands. The cost had been terrible, but the way was open. For the first time in history, Israeli soldiers stood on the heights that for decades had loomed over their homes. Below them, the Galilee stretched like a promise, safe from the weapons that had once stalked it. But the war was not yet over. Further south, the Syrian divisions were regrouping. Damascus itself, just 65 kilometers away, trembled at the sound of advancing Israeli tanks. The final act of the 6-day war was about to begin. The last day. The night of June 9th to 10th, 1967, marked the final act of the 6-day war. On the dark slopes of the Golan Heights, the Israeli offensive continued to ascend amid smoke and shattered stones. The air was thick with the smell of burning fuel and the pungent metallic aroma of shells. In the shadows, the roar of engines echoed like thunder through the valleys. Colonel Albert Mandler's tanks rolled steadily toward Quneitra, Syria's last major town in the Golan Heights. Every kilometer was a struggle. They advanced under heavy artillery, over minefields and through canyons that had become battlefields. The soldiers knew that with each ridge they crested, they were getting closer not only to victory but also to Damascus itself. As Mandler's armored vehicles battled toward Quneitra, another drama unfolded in the darkness. From the south, elements of Israel's 55th Paratroopers Brigade and mechanized units were heading north to join the fight. They had fought in the Jerusalem hills just days before. Now, with little time to rest or resupply, they were thrust into another battlefield, an even more treacherous one that stretched into the clouds. It was a night of chaos and improvisation, the kind of chaos the Israel Defense Forces had learned to master. Along desert roads and through narrow mountain passes, convoys of trucks, jeeps and tanks snaked northward with their headlights off. Clouds of dust followed them like ghosts. In a crowded briefing room, Colonel Uri Ben-Ari, commander of Israel's 10th Armored Brigade, gathered hundreds of drivers before their long night march. That night became a symbol of Israeli battlefield discipline. Against all odds, the entire brigade arrived at its coordinates at dawn, ready for combat. At dawn on June 10th, 2 Israeli brigade groups began their assault on the central Golan. Tanks moved like predators through the fog, their turrets slowly rotating, searching for Syrian weapons. Behind them, infantry followed on foot, boots slipping in the volcanic dust. At midday, a hastily formed Israeli divisional task force launched a flanking attack from the south, leaping from ridge to ridge in what soldiers would later call leapfrogging, traversing ravines and blasted slopes to outmaneuver the Syrian defenses. But the Syrians were faltering. The war had already exhausted them. The air force had been shattered by Israeli preemptive strikes. Their allies had remained silent under ceasefires, and now, with the Israeli army forcing its way through the northern and southern sectors, Damascus faced an impossible choice. One by one, the Syrian High Command began withdrawing its brigades toward the capital. The 42nd Mechanized Division quietly withdrew from the front. Its mission was no longer to fight for the Golan Heights, but to save what remained of the army. By nightfall on June 10th, the Syrian front was collapsing. Israeli tanks rolled steadily through the abandoned positions. The once fierce and determined defenders had vanished into the guns, leaving only the echo of artillery fire in the distance. By nightfall, both sides agreed to a ceasefire. The war was over. Syria had lost more than 2,500 soldiers, another 5,000 wounded, and nearly 600 captured. The Israelis had paid their own price with 127 dead and 600 wounded, but they had achieved what no one thought possible. In just 6 days, Israel had defeated 3 armies, captured vast territories, and transformed the map of the Middle East. By the dawn of June 11, 1967, the State of Israel was no longer the small, vulnerable nation it had been a week earlier. For the first time in its short history, Israel had a solid defense, the precious space it had always lacked. The Sinai Peninsula, stretching to the Suez Canal, was now in Israeli hands, with a vast desert barrier that could protect its southern border. The Golan Heights, the great volcanic plateau that had tormented the north for decades, was now safe. Israeli soldiers could look out over the Galilee, and in the West Bank, Israel had taken territories of profound historical and spiritual significance, such as Jerusalem, Hebron, and Bethlehem, places documented with thousands of years of faith and identity. But with this triumph came a bleak new reality. The victory that secured Israel's borders also brought with it new burdens. Within the occupied West Bank lived a large Palestinian population, a people without a state, now under Israeli occupation. The world watched closely. The international community refused to recognize Israel's annexation of the territories, and within Israel itself, a fierce debate erupted. Some argued that these lands were part of ancient Israel, a divine inheritance that should be colonized and preserved forever. Others warned that holding on to them would only deepen the conflict, sowing the seeds of future wars. Between 1967 and 1973, the Sinai became a vast buffer zone, a line of sand and silence separating Israel from Egypt, but also a fragile peace that it would one day destroy again. The Golan Heights became a shield, a watchtower, a strategic lookout where Israeli soldiers could protect the northern border with their eyes on the Syrian horizon. At that moment, the war was over. 6 days that changed the world, and the map of the Middle East changed forever. In that brief span, Israel achieved what many thought impossible. It fought 3 nations, 3 armies, on 3 fronts, and won. The guns fell silent, but the signs of war lingered, carried by the desert wind across the Sinai, over Galilee, and up to the Golan Heights. Victory brought not only security, but also a new and dangerous burden. In the months that followed, Israel found itself at a crossroads. It now possessed vast tracts of land and territories that stretched far beyond its 1948 borders, the Sinai Peninsula to the south, the Golan Heights to the north, the West Bank in the heart of the ancient hills of Judea and Samaria. And with this new land came an old instinct, the instinct to build. Since the founding of the state, Israelis had always been settlers and builders. They had made the desert bloom, drained swamps, and raised cities from nothing. Now that same impulse was directed toward these newly conquered lands. In the Golan Heights, where Syrian artillery had once thundered against Israeli farms, new communities began to emerge. Families planted vineyards in the black volcanic soil. Children played beneath the same hills where tanks had burned just weeks before. In the West Bank, the call of faith was strong. For many Israelis, these were not simply conquered lands. They were part of biblical Israel, the cradle of Jewish history. Ancient names like Hebron, Shiloh, and Bethel returned to the maps. They were scriptural sites that had come to life after 2,000 years. Settlers arrived with hope and ideology, driven as much by history as by destiny. They built homes, schools, and synagogues. But each new settlement came at a cost. Each had to be defended with soldiers, fortifications, and resources. And in the Sinai, where the desert stretched endlessly toward the Suez Canal, Israel also began to build. Outposts rose in the sand far from Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. They were symbols of permanence, but also ballast and forward positions that would demand protection if war returned. Israel had gained depth on the map, but paradoxically, it began to lose it in reality. Each new settlement, each outpost extended its reach, but also weakened its defenses. What had been gained as strategic space was slowly transformed into new fronts. Before the war, Israel found itself hemmed in. Ships could not access the Straits of Tiran, northern farms were bombarded by Syrian weapons, and the capital was cut in half by Jordanian barbed wire. The old city of Jerusalem had been off-limits to Jews for nearly 2 decades. In 6 chaotic days of fighting, Israel reversed all that. He opened sea routes, silenced the Syrian guns, and reunited Jerusalem, the eternal city, under his flag. But peace, as always, remained elusive. The United Nations issued a resolution urging Israel to withdraw from the territories it had captured in exchange for peace with its neighbors. Diplomats called this exchange territory for peace. But amid the smoke of victory, peace still seemed a distant dream. Israel had won militarily, but politically, the world grew restless. Its Arab neighbors refused to negotiate, declaring the infamous 3 no's in Khartoum: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. For more than a decade, the borders remained tense. The Sinai served as both a shield and a trap, the West Bank as a dam and a problem, and the Golan Heights as a fortress and a flashpoint. In the late 1970s, after years of stalemate, a breakthrough occurred that few believed possible. Israel and Egypt, once the fiercest of enemies, sat down to talk. The result was the Camp David Accords, a peace agreement that astonished the world. In 1979, Israel agreed to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for a formal peace. It was the first time an Arab nation officially recognized Israel's right to exist. However, this came at a high cost: the dismantling of Israeli settlements in the Sinai. Families who had built their homes there now watched as soldiers helped them tear them down, packing their lives into trucks and leaving the desert behind. But for the first time, there was peace on Israel's southern border. The border with Egypt fell silent. More than 20 years later, Israel and Jordan, 2 nations that once locked in battle in the hills above Jerusalem, also signed an open peace treaty. 2 kings, 2 enemies turned allies, shook hands. It seemed that the 1967 promise of land for peace, proposed earlier, might finally be realized. And yet, even decades later, much remains to be done. More than 30 years after the 6-Day War, Israelis felt no safer than before. Old fears lingered with rockets from the north, internal bombing, and rumors of new wars on the horizon. The territories captured in 1967 became the same lands that defined the next half-century of conflict: Gaza, the West Bank, the Golan. The same hills, the same roads, the same borders, haunted by unfinished business. The Six-Day War had given Israel everything it had previously lacked: strategic depth, military dominance, and control over holy lands. But it had also given rise to new dilemmas, new enemies, and new questions about identity, morality, and survival. The world had witnessed in disbelief the miracle of 1967. People called it the most brilliant military campaign of the century, a classic example of speed, coordination, and audacity. But behind the headlines and parades were the faces of soldiers who never returned home, young men who had crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and fought in the alleys of Jerusalem. Many were buried far from where they were born. For their families, victory would forever carry the weight of loss. The humiliation of 1967 became a rallying cry that fueled decades of turmoil, from the rise of the Palestine Liberation Organization to the wars and uprisings that followed. The Six-Day War did not end the conflict, it merely redefined it. For Israel, the war transformed fear into confidence, but also humility into arrogance. The lightning victory generated a sense of invincibility that would prove costly 6 years later when, in 1973, on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack that nearly destroyed Israeli defenses. In the end, the borders could be taken in 6 days, but peace would take generations.